Okay, right, the celebrated Richard Walker Mark IV carp rod. This appeared in late 1952. Walker gave the B. James and Son, a London rod manufacturer, the right to produce finish rods. It was also available in kit form from a different company called J.B. Walker, no relation to Richard Walker. They were over in Hythe, where you could buy the split cane was finished and you could finish the rod off. So put the eyes on, do the handle and what have you. But I guess it's these finish rods that where the sort of legend began. This is a very early production rod from probably 1953. They were 10 foot in length. They were the first specific carp rod produced in this country. You could get other rods, of course, that would do for that. Hardy produced several sort of salmon spinning rods and what have you. But this was the first purpose-built one. They were 10 foot in length, around a £1.5 test curve. So when the tip was at right angles to the butt, that gave an approximate poundage of £1.5. They had a large, at the time, butt ring. The early ones had this clear agatine. The handle was long, 28 inches long, had a rubber button on the end. This was for double-handed casting. The Mark IV was denoted by 4 whippings here. The Mark III had 3 whippings on. This rod, in fact all the Mark IVs that came to fruition from a multitude of manufacturers in the 50s, all have their roots in this rod. Because, yes, believe it or not, this is the rod. Richard Walker made this rod, Mark IV number 1 I call it, in the winter of 1950. And he, when I say made it, he started with the raw tonking cane. He then split it, chased all the moisture out of it. He then manufactured the hexagon that you required, because obviously they're made up of portion split cane rod. He fashioned and worked out the tapers, and this is a compound taper, and just very briefly that means that the rod is not a straight taper from butt to tip. It goes in stages. You can't see it with the naked eye, but there will be more emphasis at certain points to give the required action that he was after. This particular rod, Mark IV number 1, had lined rings throughout, which was quite unusual. He did produce a number of these rods for friends. But I guess the most, well, there's 2 things that this rod has about it. Of course, this is the rod that Richard Walker used on that fateful morning of 13th of September 1952, when he successfully landed on this rod a new British record carp, originally called Ravioli and later named by a London Evening News reporter as Clarrisa. And Dick had used this for quite a few years. Some of the Arsley perch were caught on this. He used it for a bit of, I think I've got pictures of him using even for bream fishing. In 1955, the ACA, the Angling Cooperative Association, was just starting. Dick gave them this rod, donated this rod to sell and auction off to augment their funds. Very early days for the ACA. And a chap in a very famous carp angler then, and who knew Richard Walker, Dick Kefford, who lived in Norfolk, purchased the rod for 25 guineas. It was a lot of money in 1955. And it laid there in Norfolk for a long time. He used it every now and then, but he had no children to pass the rod on to, and he subsequently passed it on to another chap. And many years later, when this chap had it, he knew my interest in the rod and he showed me, and ultimately it came to pass that he had to get rid of the rod, and I bought it in 1982. So there we are. Blimey, I'm just thinking now, 30 years then. that I've had this rod. The other thing about this, I mean, obviously it's a historic rod and what have you. The other thing is that when Passion for Angling, I was slightly involved in Passion for Angling, started in 1989. It was going to be a one-off programme about red mire pools, so with Chris Yates and Bob James trying to catch a red mire carp, and obviously it developed into a series of programmes, but to start with it was going to be a one-off, and Chris asked whether he could use Mark IV No. 1, the Clarrisa rod, and of course it hadn't been at red mire for donkey's years, and he certainly was the right person to take it back. And can you believe it, this rod, of course, anybody who watches the Red Mire Myths will see that Chris not only caught a 24 pounder, the first fish of the trip on this rod, but for me, being a floater fishing angler, the big thing was that he caught a surface caught 20 pound common from red mire on this rod, and that of course is in Passion for Angling as well. You'll remember the sequence where he creeps onto the little island and gets a few fish feeding and finally teases that bait close to where the fish is. Anyway, Titanic battle, and in it came, and Chris gave me the hook when he brought the rod back. He said, there you are, you can have the hook that I caught that fish on as well. So this affected rod design forever. And it came from the fertile mind of Richard Walker. Very interesting to provide the lock-up and oomph of the rod. Under here, starting here, was 24 inches of dowel. The split cane on the bottom section went plugged into a dowel, a straight level piece of dowel wood which formed the handle. When you bend this rod, when it reaches its test curve and really starts to bend, this doesn't bend any further. This provides, and it also helped in casting as well. There were several groundbreaking features about this rod. Parallel aluminium butt was created by Walker in the lawnmower factory where he was director of Lloyd's of Letchworth. This here, a bit of cork, nifty ideas, stop the things going back, the rubber button to dig in your groin if you really want to give it a bit of oomph. I mean, you've got to remember in these days, and so when Walker made this rod, we had none of the modern glues. These were animal glues that were stuck together, the various pieces of cane. One of the biggest problems with cane, as I often say to people, they say, well, they're only ever good for fishing round corners because they're so bent. Well, when you think at the time, and certainly in the 50s and 60s, people who used these rods often put them all away in damp rod bags and then hung them in damp sheds. And any chip, any serious chip in the varnish there would allow moisture to get into the cane, and that's what the killer is to cane, moisture. Which is why a good, enclosed varnish finish is important, because once moisture gets in there, you're on your way to getting a bend, a permanent bend, especially in the tip sections. Modern split cane rods, of which there are a number of manufacturers doing, use very advanced glues. They produce it in what is called an impregnated finish, which has resin soaked in, so they don't need any varnish. They are impervious to water. My own rod, the Crystal All-Rounder, but I mentioned that while I'm here, is one such rod. When I specified the design for this, it was, I went for, as you can see there's no varnish there, I went for the impregnated, which, well, blimey, I've had this rod since 1994. I tried several prototypes out until I got to this one, and then I said, right, this is it. And so then I specified what colour I wanted the whip-ins. I think we added an extra cork or two or something like that. And he said, well, if you'd like to come next week, you can come pick the rod up. I said, great. Yeah, I went. And he said, oh, by the way, he said, I think we've got a reasonable market for these. We're going to number them. I said, oh, good idea. He said, give them a serial number. Okay. He said, you'll like your serial number. It isn't number 1. Guess what it is? It's 00 stroke 00.